They like to say James Brown carried most of his secrets into the grave. But that isn't entirely true. Buried in the whispers of old studios, behind late-night jam sessions and half-slurred confessions, there's one story the industry has spent decades pretending never existed. It begins in 1987 inside a smoke-choked recording studio in Atlanta. The godfather of soul, pacing like a caged animal, suddenly stopped, seen his crew in the eye, and said he was finally ready to reveal the 5 biggest disappointments of his life. Not business failures, not bad deals. Women. According to the men who claimed they were there, James said he had a private list of 5 black female superstars the world worshipped but who in his eyes were terrible lovers, each one for a reason darker, stranger, and more personal than anyone outside those walls would ever imagine. For years that list existed only as rumor. A ghost story traded in the backs of tour buses and behind dressing room doors, always in low voices, always followed by "You didn't hear this from me." Tonight we open that file, and once you hear what's inside, some say you'll never look at these legends quite the same way again. 1. Chaka Khan, the voice of fire with a silence that unnerved James Brown. James Brown once told people that Chaka Khan could shake an entire church with a single note. On stage, he said she was a natural disaster, pure flame. But according to the same late-night confession behind a closed door, she could fall into a silence so deep it unsettled him in a way he never forgot. When that remark slipped out of his mouth in that Atlanta studio, it dragged a chain of buried memories back to the surface, old backstage gossip fragments of stories from the early 80s, half-remembered moments that people thought they'd forgotten. To understand why Chaka was the first name he allegedly fired off that night, you have to rewind to the years when the spotlight adored her, but the shadows trailing behind her told a much darker story. The date, July 29, 1987. Atlanta. The night was heavy, humid, the kind of southern heat that makes the air cling to your skin like wet fabric. Inside the studio, the clock on the hallway wall had just clicked past 2:14 a.m. Ashtrays overflowed with cigarette butts. Bourbon bottles sat empty on the console. Smoke curled lazily along the ceiling like a slow-moving storm cloud. James Brown, restless and half-drunk, paced the length of the room, jaw-clenched, shoulders tight like a man trying to hold back an explosion. Then he stopped, planted both hands on the mixing board, leaned forward and dropped a sentence that froze everyone. "If you want the truth," he reportedly said, "Chaka's at the top of the list." No one laughed. No one cracked a joke. The name Chaka was too heavy, too sacred for anyone to pretend they didn't hear it. But James kept going, his voice gravelly, slow, deliberate. All performance, he said, no passion. Some of the musicians later swore the temperature in the room seemed to drop after those words. Others said they weren't shocked, not because they believed him, but because they'd already heard scattered versions of the same story from dancers, backup singers, and old road managers. Stories that floated around like ghosts, but were never spoken above a whisper. To see the full picture, you have to go back even further to Chicago, 1970. Chaka Khan was just 17 when she joined Rufus, but people who met her at that age swore she walked into every room like she'd already lived 2 lifetimes. On stage, she was pure fire, untamed, explosive, impossible to ignore. Backstage, though, she was often something very different. Members of Rufus remembered her sitting alone in dressing rooms, wrapped in a thick jacket no matter how hot the stage lights had been. Some nights she joked with everyone loud and bright, like the life of the party. On other nights she simply disappeared, no explanation, no call until someone discovered her days later, in another city, staring past them with a distant look in her eyes. She was the sun a guitarist from those early years supposedly said. But some days the sun just shut off. By the early 1980s, the whispers about Chaka's private life had grown darker, more frantic. There were nights she never showed up at the studio. Nights she cried in the hallway before a session. Nights she sat in a chair staring at the floor, refusing to speak to anyone. People close to her spoke quietly about addiction, depression, old wounds that never healed. They said intimacy seemed to frighten her more than fame ever could. Those stories were always padded, softened, covered up by managers who did not want headlines. But according to the men who insist they heard it from his own mouth, James Brown experienced something that for him confirmed those rumors. The story leads back to August 14, 1984. Los Angeles. The setting was an awards show after-party. Chaka was electric that night, laughing, dancing, pulling James by the hand across the floor like they were two kids escaping a chaperone dance. James later told one of his backup singers he thought he'd just met the wildest woman in R&B. But according to his alleged account, once the door closed behind them, everything changed. Instead of the blazing force from the dance floor, Chaka went quiet. Not shy, not teasing. Quiet in a way that felt like she had retreated miles inside herself. She lay back, but barely touched him, barely responded, hardly met his eyes. James said he thought she'd fallen asleep. I was doing everything he reportedly told one bandmate. She wasn't even there. A dancer from the same tour added fuel to the rumor years later. She claimed Chaka often avoided intimacy altogether. Instead, she would ask people simply to lie next to her. No touching, no kissing. Just stay until she drifted off. According to that dancer, it was as if Chaka didn't know what to do with tenderness or didn't want to feel anything at all. Those stories matched what others had seen in the studio. One sound engineer described a session in June 1983. Chaka walked into the vocal booth, put on the headphones, and froze. No movement, no blinking, just a long, empty stillness that scared everyone on the other side of the glass. At first they thought she was high. Then someone whispered that she'd been crying in the bathroom for almost 30 minutes before the session even started. That same eerie stillness, James Brown later claimed, followed her into their private encounter. When he spoke about her on that hot Atlanta night, he described it as scary quiet, like she had stepped out of her own body. Like her soul, he supposedly said, went out for air and forgot to come back. One road manager who had worked with both artists offered a gentler theory. He believed Chaka was terrified of being judged by lovers. After one concert, she allegedly confessed, "People expect fireworks because of who I am on stage. But off stage, I'm tired. I just want peace. I just want sleep." Peace, sleep, silence. 3 words that seemed to follow her through the entire decade. By 1989, Chaka entered rehab publicly, for the first time privately. Some say not the last. And suddenly all those earlier whispers about emotional distance, shutting down, disappearing, mid-feeling started to make sense to people around her. Friends insisted she wasn't cold. She was hurt. And hurt people don't always know how to love the way others expect. But that night, in Atlanta, James Brown wasn't thinking about trauma psychology or survival. He was thinking about the woman he expected to be pure wildfire and instead found unreachable shadow. According to those in the room, he ended his rant about Chaka with one line that cut like broken glass. "Amazing voice," he muttered, empty heart. Whether that was truth, cruelty, bitterness, or just the late-night confession of a disappointed man, nobody can say for sure. Chaka never publicly addressed the rumor. James never talked about it on record. But the men in that smoke-filled room swore he meant every word. And then, without lowering his voice, he moved on to the next name. A name that made him shake his head and say, "Now this one shocked me the most." 2. Diana Ross, the Motown queen. James Brown said he couldn't feel. People in the room that night claimed James Brown didn't pause for even a second before dropping the second name. He leaned back in his chair, rubbed his temples like the memory gave him a headache, and muttered that Diana Ross could control a stage, a crowd, and an entire brand, but not her own body once the lights went out. With that, the air inside the Atlanta studio shifted again. Heavier, sharper. If the Chaka rumor sounded like messy gossip, the Diana story felt like a crack running straight through a monument. Because Diana Ross wasn't just another singer, She was Motown royalty. A woman built brick by brick out of diamonds, discipline, and a flawless public image. And that image was exactly why the whispers around her were so fiercely buried. To understand how her name ended up on James Brown's private list, you have to step inside the world Motown built for her, polished, choreographed, measured down to the millimeter. In the late 1960s, Ross moved through Berry Gordy's empire like a queen in training. Every gesture was coached, every expression rehearsed, every flaw carefully hidden. People close to the label still talk about how she would stand in front of hotel mirrors at 2 a.m, practicing her speaking voice, adjusting tone, adjusting posture, adjusting the way she held her chin until she looked like someone worthy of the spotlight and nothing less. That kind of discipline can create one kind of star and destroy another kind of woman. Fast forward to September 12, 1983. Backstage at a charity gala in New York City. A former Motown assistant, now retired, claimed this was the night he realized Ross lived in constant fear of being anything less than perfect. He said she locked herself in her dressing room and refused to undress as long as assistant stylists or stagehands were anywhere near the hallway. Not just because she wanted privacy, everyone wants that, but because, according to him, she refused to let anyone see her unless she controlled every angle, every shadow, every inch of exposed skin. He swore Ross kept a small suitcase filled with soft lamps in her dressing rooms, so that even her own reflection in the mirror was carefully lit, safe from harsh light, safe from surprise. That obsession with image, James Brown claimed, followed her straight into the bedroom. He allegedly told a friend that being with Ross felt less like desire and more like paperwork, a business meeting, a negotiation. Pretty smile, perfect posture, but no real heat. No spontaneity. No surrender. That friend later repeated James's words almost exactly. Ross is sexy on stage, but in bed she's like she's signing a damn contract. And it wasn't just James saying it. People who worked close to Diana whispered similar things for years. A former Supremes tour coordinator said Ross controlled intimacy the way she controlled choreography, step by step, breath by breath. She didn't like surprises. She didn't like being touched without warning. She didn't like anything that wasn't rehearsed or approved. The coordinator remembered one night in 1978 when Ross dismissed a lover from her hotel room because he moved too fast and messed up her energy. She reportedly spent the rest of the night pacing the suite in a satin robe, pouring herself more wine, muttering that chaos was the enemy of success. Then there was the strangest rumor of all, the one James repeated that night in Atlanta. People said Diana Ross never turned the lights fully off. A dancer who toured with her in 1981 claimed the dimmest setting on Ross's bedside lamps was still bright enough to read sheet music. She joked that Ross seemed afraid the dark might reveal a version of herself she couldn't manage or correct. Whether that came from insecurity, old wounds, or pure vanity, nobody knew for sure. But everyone who repeated the story agreed on one thing: Diana Ross had no intention of letting anyone see her without the mask she had spent her entire life constructing. That mask infuriated James Brown. He supposedly told his band that being intimate with someone who never surrendered, never really connected, made him feel like a stranger paying rent in her house. He described her touch as polite, her kisses as cautious, her body as permanently tense. According to him, Ross didn't melt. She didn't lean in. She didn't breathe with him. She performed. And for a man who built his entire identity on raw physical soul, that was the ultimate letdown. But it wasn't only a wounded ego talking. Quiet voices echoed his frustration in different ways. A Motown house musician once overheard Ross telling a backup singer she hated sex because it made her feel unprepared. Another source claimed Ross confessed to a friend after a breakup in 1985 that she had never felt safe enough with anyone to truly let go. Perhaps the saddest rumor came from a makeup artist who worked with her in London. According to the artist, Ross broke down in tears after a lover saw her without her wig for the first time. The makeup artist said Ross whispered, "He looked at me like I was ordinary." Ordinary, the one word Diana Ross seems to have spent her entire life running from. And maybe that was the core truth James never bothered to consider. Maybe her careful, restrained, almost mechanical intimacy wasn't coldness at all, but the result of being told for decades that she had to be extraordinary every second she existed. Maybe she never learned how to be a woman in private because she was never allowed to be anything but a star. But James Brown wasn't in the mood for nuance that night in Atlanta. In his voice, there was no sympathy, only exhaustion and disappointment. The men in that room say he ended the Diana Ross chapter with a single quiet sentence that made everybody shift in their seats. "She controls the world," he muttered, "except herself." Then he exhaled, leaned forward again, and braced his palms on the console as if he were about to walk into a storm. Because the third name, the one coming next, made him grimace, shake his head, and admit something he never thought he would say. 3. Donna Summer, the disco queen who disappeared inside her own spotlight. Somewhere between the cigarette haze of that Atlanta studio and the half-empty bourbon bottles sitting on the console, James Brown took a long breath and said the next name. His tone shifted. It wasn't sharp like when he spoke about Diana Ross. It wasn't bitter like the way he described Chaka. It sounded more like disbelief, like he still couldn't quite understand what he had seen. "Donna," he muttered. "Donna Summer. Man, that one surprised me." And just like that, the room changed again. Because Donna Summer was not some minor name you could toss around lightly. She was the soundtrack of an era, the voice of dance floors, neon nights, and sweat-slicked clubs all over the world. The brighter her legacy glowed, the darker this rumor felt in comparison. To understand how she ended up on James Brown's late-night list, you have to go back to 1975. Munich. Donna was 26, an American singer trying to outrun her past. Germany was supposed to be a reset, a life without Boston childhood memories, without the strict weight of church expectations, without the guilt and family pressure that had shadowed her for years. But Munich brought its own ghosts. Producers Giorgio Moroder and Pete Bellotte remembered Donna walking into the studio like someone trying on a new skin. She laughed loud, talked big, but would suddenly fall quiet like she'd just remembered something heavy she couldn't put down. Moroder later admitted that during the recording of Love to Love You, baby Donna kept stepping out of the booth. She would pace the hallway, hands shaking, not because she was scared to sing. She'd been singing in church since she was a child, but because the persona she was being asked to inhabit didn't quite fit. She was scared and excited at the same time, Moroder said years later. It was like watching someone choose their own mask. The mask worked better than anyone expected. By 1977, Donna Summer wasn't just Donna anymore. She was Donna, the disco goddess, the breathy moans over synths, the queen of mirror ball fantasies. People who toured with her said she barely slept. They remembered her crying before shows, then walking on stage an hour later, glowing like she'd been carved out of pure gold. Donna didn't walk on stage, one backup singer said. She floated. Backstage, she collapsed. That's where the whispers began. There was the infamous 1979 incident in a Manhattan hotel room. According to a story passed quietly between managers and stylists, Donna locked herself in the bathroom for nearly 2 hours after a fan shouted, "Sing it like you mean it," during a meet and greet. People outside the door heard thumps, muffled crying, and her voice repeating, "I'm not who they think I am. I'm not that woman." When she finally opened the door, mascara streaked down her cheeks. She reportedly told her hairdresser, "I feel like I'm lying to the whole world." That, some say, was the moment the religious guilt returned, the strict upbringing she'd tried to escape in Europe, hooking itself back into her like a barbed wire. By early 1980, Donna publicly talked about finding Christ again. Some fans were moved. Others were confused. Her label, insiders claimed, was terrified. A former Casablanca Records executive said the company went into panic mode. Marketing plans were shredded. Meetings stretched late into the night. People whispered about rebranding Donna as a pure artist, trying to navigate the tension between her new spiritual convictions and the sensual icon the world already knew. The transition was messy, sloppy, Between tour dates, Donna reportedly spent hours praying backstage. She refused certain VIP meetings. She broke down when old photos of her most provocative performances appeared in magazines. One stylist remembered her standing in a dressing room in Tokyo costume hanging loose at her sides, whispering, "If I die tonight, at least God will see I tried." The pressure only intensified when disco officially died in America around 1983. Radio stations turned on it. DJs staged record-burning events. Crowds booed the genre she had helped build. Donna took it personally. According to her assistant, she often said they worshipped me, then blamed me for everything. She felt like the industry had swallowed her whole, then spit her out the second they decided they didn't need her glow anymore. That was also when the darkest rumors about her state of mind began to circulate, not about scandal, but about fragility. There was the Tonight Show incident in 1984. Backstage, just minutes before she was supposed to walk out and perform, Donna reportedly froze. The stage manager later said she stared at the curtain like it was the edge of a cliff. She whispered, "They're all waiting for the Donna I used to be. But she's gone." They had to delay the taping for nearly 11 minutes. Then came the collapse in Rome, a story insiders still argue about. Midway through a show, Donna stopped singing, clutched her chest, and walked off stage without a word. Fans thought she was physically sick. Crew members later insisted her body was fine, her mind was exhausted. One band member said she looked at the crowd like they were devouring her. By the late 1980s, Donna Summer was tangled in a web of contradictions. The church wanted her to repent. The label wanted her to entertain. The fans wanted the fantasy back. And Donna herself was stuck in the middle, being torn in two directions that no one else had to live with. That emotional fracture, James Brown claimed, was exactly what he encountered in private, just not on stage and not in front of cameras. According to people who heard his version, he said Donna felt half present, half somewhere else. That she performed emotions instead of feeling them. That she could switch on the persona when the world was watching and then shut down completely when the lights faded. He reportedly told a saxophonist later Donna acted like she was still on camera. Then the camera cuts and she shuts off like someone pulled the plug. Industry voices unintentionally echoed that description. A choreographer said Donna was the most professional woman he'd ever worked with, but admitted that between takes she often sat perfectly still, hands clenched, staring into empty space. A photographer who shot her several times claimed she was terrified of unedited photos. A manager said she apologized constantly for her voice, her appearance, her past, her future. She wore shame like jewelry, he said. To some, that didn't make Donna weak. It made her human, a woman, crushed between faith, fame, expectation, and a persona too heavy for any one person to carry forever. Yet when James Brown finished telling his story in that Atlanta studio, he didn't call her tragic or broken or complicated. He leaned back, sighed, and summed it up in a single sentence. Donna tried too hard, he reportedly said. That was her curse. Then for the first time that night he let himself grin. And what he said next shifted the whole mood of the room. But the fourth name he told them, that one made me laugh. Because Lord, she was clumsy as hell. 4. Patti LaBelle, the woman whose power overflowed every quiet moment. The room had gone bone still after Donna Summer's chapter. James Brown sat forward, elbows on his knees, eyes glassy from exhaustion and memory. But when he finally said the fourth name, something in his tone shifted, not darker, not crueler, but almost amused. Patti, he said, shaking his head with a strange mix of affection and disbelief. Patti LaBelle. That woman's got the energy of an atomic bomb, but she never knows where to put her hands. The crew laughed uneasy, not because it was truly funny, but because with Patti LaBelle, nothing was ever subtle. Everything about her felt like too much, and somehow still not enough. Patti's place on the list was different from the others. With Chaka, James had sounded disappointed, with Diana frustrated, with Donna bewildered. But Patti was a story he almost enjoyed telling, the way someone talks about a natural disaster they barely survived. Because Patti LaBelle wasn't just a diva. She was a storm dressed in sequins, gospel fire, and Philadelphia steel. Too honest, too loud, too intense for an industry that preferred its women polished, predictable, and easy to manage. To understand why she landed in James Brown's late-night confession, you have to rewind to February 1974, when Label the group, not just the woman, was busy tearing up the rulebook for female vocal trios. Gone were the matching dresses and gentle smiles. In their place came metallic bodysuits, futuristic wigs, and Patti screaming high notes that sounded like they ripped straight up her spine. People still talk about one night in San Francisco when she hit a whistle note and a spotlight above her reportedly cracked. A sound engineer swore the bulb wasn't faulty. That was Patti, he said. But with that kind of power came something else: recklessness. A total lack of finesse. Patti did everything at full blast, laughing, crying, hugging, arguing, loving. One tour manager said Patti didn't enter a room, she detonated into it. And that detonation didn't always land in the right place. Backstage stories painted her as warm but overwhelming, affectionate but dangerous in cramped spaces. A makeup artist once described Patti hugging her so tightly she knocked an entire table of brushes and powders onto the floor. A musician recalled Patti slapping him on the back during a joke so hard he spilled hot coffee across a mixing console. "She never knows her own strength," he said. "It's like she assumes everyone else is built like her." That was exactly the reputation James Brown leaned into. According to a longtime friend, a guitarist who'd known him since the early 70s, James once complained that Patti had too much energy for her own good, that she didn't think before she moved, that she didn't slow down long enough to read the room or the body in front of her. Another road musician elaborated, saying Patti's charm was big-hearted, but messy, especially in moments that called for tenderness. She was real, he said. Too real. Subtle, that was never in her vocabulary. The stories kept coming. During a 1979 tour stop in Chicago, a dancer claimed Patti was demonstrating a soft, delicate arm movement during rehearsal, something slow and graceful. But Patti didn't do slow. The dancer swore Patti swung her arm with so much enthusiasm, she accidentally smacked another performer across the face, nearly knocking her off the stage. Patti allegedly burst into tears afterward, apologizing over and over, insisting she hadn't meant it. She was all heart, the dancer said. Just no breaks. James Brown, according to those who sat in that Atlanta studio, recounted Patti's clumsiness with a strange kind of affection. He wasn't tearing her down. He was describing a chaos that seemed to follow her like a second shadow. He claimed Patti once hugged him so hard after a show that she cracked his sunglasses. Another time, during a collaborative rehearsal in 1982, she supposedly tried to adjust his tie mid-conversation, yanked too hard and ripped it clean off. "She's powerful," James reportedly said. "Too powerful for quiet moments." That idea that Patti LaBelle didn't really understand softness was echoed by many around her. A choreographer remembered trying to teach her minimal controlled hand gestures for a stripped-down ballad. Patti kept overshooting the movements, fingers splayed, arms wide, turning what was meant to be a whisper into a shout. She was incapable of gentle, the choreographer said. Even her tenderness was loud. Then there was the now famous rehearsal incident in Los Angeles in 1985. Patti was demonstrating how to place a hand lightly on someone's shoulder for staging. Just a gentle touch. But Patti didn't do gentle. A dancer claimed she pushed down with so much force he stumbled forward, twisted his ankle, and had to sit out the next 2 shows. Patti apologized so intensely she sent flowers every day for a week. Patti loved big, he said. She just didn't know how to scale it down. That was the core of every rumor. Patti LaBelle lived her entire life at maximum volume, maximum emotion, maximum effort, maximum presence. She didn't know how to shrink herself, even when the moment begged for quiet. Between laughter and a deep sigh, James supposedly summed it up like this. "Patti's like grabbing a live wire," he said. "You touch her and boom, you're gone." He didn't say it with cruelty. He said it like a man still half dazed by the impact. Industry insiders felt the same. A Motown producer once called Patti the most generous hurricane you'll ever meet. A stagehand from her 1986 tour remembered her rushing to help fix a crooked mix stand only to snap it in half by accident. "She means well," he said, "but she's a force. And forces break things." Whether those stories were exaggerated, misremembered, or polished over time, they built a single image Patti LaBelle as a woman who didn't fit inside delicate moments. And James Brown knew it. That night in Atlanta, after finishing the Patti chapter, James leaned back with a crooked smirk. The room relaxed for the first time in hours. Someone laughed for real this time. Someone else reached for another drink. Patti's story, unlike the others, didn't leave the taste of bitterness. Just the memory of a woman too powerful, too unfiltered to ever make herself small for anyone. But the smirk didn't last, because as James stared into the bottom of his glass, his face changed again, and he said something that made every man in that studio sit up straight. And the last name he told them quietly, the last one nobody ever believes she's on this list. 5. Aretha Franklin, the only woman James Brown was afraid of. The room had just begun to loosen up after the Patti LaBelle story. A few nervous chuckles, arms uncrossed, shoulders easing. Then James Brown went silent. Not the dramatic silence of a performer. A different kind. Heavy. Honest. He stared at the floor for a long time, thumb tracing the edge of his shoe before lifting his head and speaking in a voice that didn't sound like the James they knew. "The last name," he said, "I thought I'd take this one to the grave." The laughter died instantly. Everyone in that studio would later swear the temperature dropped. No one shifted. No one cleared their throat. Whatever he was about to say, they understood it wasn't a joke. And then he said it. Aretha. No last name. He didn't need one. In that smoky Atlanta studio in the summer of 1987, there was only one Aretha, the Queen of Soul, the woman whose voice sounded like it could crack the sky. James rubbed the back of his neck like a man touching the edge of an old wound. "Y'all don't understand," he muttered. "That woman, she scared me." James Brown was many things: angry, proud, reckless, relentless. But afraid, that word didn't fit him. Or at least it never showed. And yet here he was admitting something no one in the room had ever expected to hear. To understand why Aretha Franklin's name carried such a charge, you have to go back to Detroit, February 1983, backstage at the Fox Theater. The night was brutally cold, the kind of winter that makes the wind sound like it's yelling at the buildings. James was touring with his Cold Sweat Revue, and Aretha was in town for another event. By chance or fate, their teams ended up sharing the same backstage space. A former Motown technician, one of the last people claimed to have seen what happened, said he witnessed something that didn't match anything he'd seen in years of dealing with powerful egos. He said James Brown stepped aside, not in passing, not by accident, stepped aside deliberately like a bodyguard making room for royalty. Aretha walked in wearing a floor-length fur coat, her expression blank but commanding. She didn't smile. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't need to. The atmosphere shifted around her, the way metal bends around a magnet. According to the technician, James tried to greet her half-ready with a joke, a line, a playful jab. Aretha looked at him once. Just once. And James stopped mid-sentence. It was like watching a gunfighter meet someone faster, the tech said. James didn't intimidate her, and she didn't care who he was. That's what shook him. The rumor that followed them for years was simple: James Brown and Aretha Franklin were two alike. Two monarchs from two different kingdoms forced to stand in the same room without bowing. Both carried childhood trauma like armor. Both demanded absolute control. Both were known for explosive tempers honed by years of exploitation. Both understood that their talent wasn't a gift. It was a weapon and a burden. But where James exploded, Aretha tightened. Where he shouted, she stared. Where he threatened, she dismissed. People around them said James felt like Aretha could see straight through him, past the bravado, past the myth, into the parts of himself he spent a lifetime refusing to look at. And that more than anything terrified him. A saxophonist who toured with James in 1985 claimed James once confessed, "Aretha's the only one I can't read." He said Aretha had a way of sitting silently in a room that made other people fill the space. They would talk, over-explain, argue, unravel, while she said almost nothing. She didn't have to raise her voice, the sax player said. Her silence was louder than James's screams. By the mid-80s, whatever relationship existed between them had hardened into something complicated. Not open war, not friendship, something colder. A quiet standoff. Insiders whispered about a private confrontation in Los Angeles in 1986. The details blurred over time. 4 walls raised voices, a door slamming, but the ending was always the same in every version. They left the room separately. They never spoke of it again. A producer who overheard fragments said James stormed out looking rattled. Aretha walked out seconds later, calm, adjusting her earrings like she'd just finished a routine conversation. When he asked one of Aretha's assistants what had happened, she allegedly replied, "She doesn't lose." That was the thing about Aretha Franklin. She didn't lose arguments, rooms, narratives. Once she stepped into a space, she owned it, not with threats, but with presence. She didn't demand loyalty. She inspired it. She didn't chase power. She embodied it. James Brown spent his entire life fighting for dominance. Aretha Franklin never had to fight. She already was the standard. According to the men in that Atlanta studio, James took a long breath before finishing his confession. He said Aretha wasn't like the others he'd mentioned that night. With Chaka, he felt disappointed. With Diana, annoyed. With Donna, confused. With Patti, exhausted and entertained. But with Aretha, with her, he said, "I felt small." "Well, don't get it," James told him softly. Aretha walks into a room and takes your breath without saying one damn word. He leaned back, eyes unfocused, like he was watching a scene replay in his mind. She was the only one who could shut me up. For a man like James Brown, that was the real confession. Then came the final rumor, the one only a couple of people in that room ever dared repeat. James allegedly admitted that he once tried to push Aretha behind closed doors, not violently, not with rage, just as James always did, testing boundaries, asserting his presence, demanding space. Aretha didn't shout. She didn't posture. She didn't threaten. She just stepped closer, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "Sit down, James." And he did. No one knows if that moment happened exactly that way. Maybe it was exaggerated. Maybe it was half true. Maybe the bourbon did some of the talking. But the men who heard it believed the story, if not word for word, then in spirit. James's face as he told it, tired, humbled, almost relieved, suggested there was more truth in it than he ever meant to share. When he finished, he didn't smile. He didn't brag. He just gave them one last sentence. "She was the only woman I could never talk back to." With that, the list was complete, not just of lovers or disappointments, but of the only 5 women, according to that late-night confession, who left James Brown feeling something he never admitted in public, outmatched, exposed, or undone. As he stood to leave the studio, someone finally asked why he'd told them at all. James paused at the doorway, didn't look back, and said quietly, "'Cause pretending ain't worth it when the truth keeps following you." Years later, that story still lives in the cracks of music history, half rumor, half confession, all shadow. James Brown paused before revealing the final name, and the entire room froze. When he finally whispered Aretha, the air changed. He told his crew she was the only woman who ever made him feel small, the only presence he couldn't outshine or overpower. People who worked near them insisted Aretha never needed to raise her voice. Her silence did the cutting. One rumor claimed she once looked James in the eyes and simply said, "Sit down." And he did. "She was the only one I couldn't talk back to," he admitted. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name. In the comments, we'd like to explore their journey as well.